If it's Wednesday tested on the world stage, President Biden pushes to expand NATO as Vladimir Putin seeks deeper ties with China. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen heads to Beijing, and U.S. forces intervene as Iran tries to seize a pair of oil tankers. Plus, cocaine mystery at the White House. A lab test confirms that the substance discovered inside the West Wing Sunday night was, in fact, cocaine, as questions swirl over who it belonged to and how it got there. And violence and grief grip the Middle East as the deadly conflict between Israelis and Palestinians raises new alarms about the potential for spiraling violence in the region. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander, and today for Chuck Todd, as the White House and President Biden find themselves facing a series of new clashes and confrontations with the U.S.'s most significant foreign adversaries, Russia, China, Iran. As the war in Ukraine rages on this afternoon, the president renewed his effort to expand NATO's power, welcoming Sweden's prime minister to the White House and pushing for the Nordic country to be added to the NATO alliance.
I want to reiterate, the United States fully supports Sweden's membership in NATO. And the bottom line is simple. Sweden is going to make our alliance stronger and has the same value set that we have in NATO. And anxiously looking forward for your membership.
The move comes amid new calls from foreign policy experts, even some NATO member states, for the White House to help pave a path for Ukraine to join the NATO alliance as well, that Putin says would be a red line for Russia. Meanwhile, the Russian president, in the aftermath of last month's armed rebellion, is looking to deepen his ties to U.S. rival China, appearing virtually alongside Chinese President Xi and a number of leaders from Central Asian nations. That summit comes as the Financial Times is reporting that Xi personally warned Putin against using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, a report we should note that the Kremlin denies. With the Russian-Chinese alliance in the spotlight, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is now en route to Beijing as the administration tries to stabilize relations with China, despite months now of escalating military, economic, and diplomatic tensions. And amid all of that, U.S. officials are also facing new reports of Iranian aggression. Today, the U.S. Navy says it intervened in the Strait of Hormuz after Iran tried to seize a pair of oil tankers. The military releasing video and images of the confrontation in which it says Iran opened fire on one of the vessels. Iran has denied claims they tried to seize those ships. To get us started this very busy day for the White House on the world stage, we're joined now by Mike Memoli. He's outside the White House. Kelly Kobiea is in Ukraine for us. And Courtney Kuby is at the Pentagon today. Ma'am, let me start with you on the North Lawn, if I can. We know the Swedish Prime Minister on the guest list there, meeting with President Biden today. Talk about the significance of their potentially joining NATO here and how confident the administration is that they can get Turkey and Hungary to back down. The desire was to get this all signed and sealed before the president heads to NATO next week.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. The president was very happy to welcome Sweden's prime minister to Washington, to the White House today, but he would much prefer to be meeting with him as a NATO member in Vilnius next week at that NATO summit. There had been a strong expectation just a month ago, in fact, President Biden saying during that Air Force Academy commencement, we all remember, for that sandbag incident, that it will happen soon, I promise you, as it relates to Sweden membership. But the nature of NATO membership is every single one of the NATO allies need to agree on any new partner. And at this point, Hungary, as well as Turkey, continues to have reservations about it. Why would it be significant? Of course, well, President Biden considers one of the biggest accomplishments in office so far the fact that he's not only kept the Western alliance together in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but he's actually strengthened it by adding Finland already to NATO, and Sweden, which would be a very capable military partner to that alliance. And so there is continued outreach to Turkey and to Hungary to try to move this forward. Turkey's objections have to do with the fact that they're concerned about anti-Muslim protests that we've seen recently in Stockholm specifically. And so there's all likelihood not going to be resolving this in the week, but certainly the president believes still and has confidence, we're told, that ultimately they will join that alliance.
Mike, let me ask you about the White House and what you're hearing there about this meeting with Modi, the Indian president meeting with Vladimir Putin and Xi after President Biden rolled out the red carpet for Modi here, that state visit only a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, one of the reasons you did see that quite warm welcome, despite some of the Democratic objections, concerns that were raised, Democratic with a small d, about India's human rights record, for instance, was because the White House sees India very much as in play here at a time of great competition between autocracies and democracies. You've seen the president embracing India as a member of a Quad, an alliance primarily about sort of countering Chinese efforts to expand their influence, but even more so the fact that the White House had concerns about India's reliance on Russia for military hardware. That's why some of the announcements were so significant from the perspective of White House officials that were made as part of that state visit. One, opening up port access in India to American naval vessels for repairs and the like. But secondly, also that announcement of potentially providing the software, the power, the ability to construct engines for their own military aircraft in India to bring them closer to them as well. So they understand, they see that India has continued to have these relationships with Moscow in particular at a problematic time, but that's why the full court press continues on the part of the White House to keep Modi close to them as well.
Of course, Presidents Putin and Xi, I should say, Prime Minister Modi. He just said that we get all right for the sake of this conversation. Kelly, on the ground in Ukraine, I want to ask you about the circumstances there. We've seen these traded accusations between Ukraine and Russia about the situation around that Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant right now. What is the latest, especially as it relates to the new threat that we're learning about there?
Yeah, so Ukraine has been sounding the alarm on this, Peter, for some time now, but that has really been ratcheted up over the past 24 hours or so. We've been hearing from several top-level government officials warning that Russia was planning some sort of an attack at the plant. President Zelensky even weighing in last night, putting out a tweet accusing the Russians who have controlled that plant, occupied it since March of last year, of planting some sort of explosive on two of the power units. Now, not necessarily to create some sort of nuclear meltdown, but really more of an incident to blame Ukraine for acting recklessly during the war and firing some sort of explosives toward the plant. It got to the point, Peter, last night where people were checking their news feeds almost through the night, worried that they were going to have some sort of alert to evacuate the area. That's how anxious people were here. Obviously, nothing happened, but Zelensky and others have been jumping up and down, trying to get the world's attention on this for some time now, for a number of days, if not weeks. The Russians have denied that they've planted anything. The IAEA, the nuclear watchdog for the United Nations, has said that they were at that plant a couple weeks ago, didn't see any evidence of any kind of sabotage, but they've now requested access once again, just to be sure that there's nothing going on there. Peter.
If I can, Kelly, I want to also ask you about Vladimir Putin making his first appearance since that Wagner rebellion, said that things inside Russia are effectively going well. What do we know about his status, the circumstances there? It was sort of a notable scene to see him and Xi and Modi side by side virtually today in the wake of that attempted mutiny. It appeared just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, and it seems that there's a concerted effort on the part of the Kremlin to put him front and center now since that attempted rebellion. We've seen him several times now and seen him in some situations where we're not used to seeing him, and with some expressions, frankly, that we're not used to seeing. In that virtual summit, the message there was very much that he is still in control. He said that Russia is more unified than ever, trying to project the idea that Russia is solid and stable and that he is in control, and also a message of defiance to Western leaders, saying that they would continue to oppose Western sanctions, that Russia was still growing despite what he called external sanctions, provocations, and pressure. But then in addition to that, Peter, we also saw this very interesting, and as you mentioned, that was with Prime Minister Modi and President Xi of China both watching in. And in addition to that, just a few hours later, we saw President Putin in his Kremlin office with a little girl smiling, laughing, kissing her on the forehead, inviting her to sit on his chair in his office. Again, yet more messaging from the Kremlin, it appears, trying to show him as a warm, generous man of the people, and bouncing off those images that we saw after the insurrection of Yevgeny Prigozhin being greeted very warmly by people in Russia. Peter.
Yeah, that propaganda is so much more notable given the recent events that we've seen happening in that region. Kelly, thank you. Mike Memley, thank you. Courtney, I do want to ask you about this latest action in the Straits of Hormuz there. Walk us through Iran. This is not new that this would be occurring. What do we make of this latest example of it right now and the sort of, I don't know, the brazenness of it?
Yeah, that's right. So there have been nearly 20 such incidents like this in the past 2 years or so, Peter. So what this is cases where the Iranian Navy will harass, at times even seize or attack commercial tankers or vessels that are moving through that Strait of Hormuz down into the Gulf of Oman and then even into the Arabian Sea. But as you mentioned, one of those cases today was more brazen than what we are used to seeing in that area. Now, there was one case around 1 a.m. local where an Iranian Navy ship trailed an oil tanker, tried to get it to stop. When a U.S. Navy ship appeared on scene, the Iranian ship left. Well, fast forward 3 hours later, this was the one that got some people's attention, where an Iranian Navy ship began to trail a separate commercial tanker. It was about 20 miles off the coast of Muscat, Oman, and it was trying to get it to stop, presumably, according to U.S. military officials, so that they could board it and seize it. Well, in the course of that, the oil tanker fired off a distress signal and would not stop. The Iranian Navy ship fired shots at that tanker, striking an area where the crew lives and works. No one was injured or killed in it, but the ship did sustain some minor damage, like the earlier incident when the USS Macaulay, U.S. Navy destroyer, and a couple of surveillance aircraft arrived overhead. The Iranian ship changed course and took off. But firing shots on a tanker and striking a tanker, a commercial vessel like this, that's a next level of provocation that we're not so accustomed to seeing in that area, Peter.
Well, so let's talk about that provocation, the escalation we appear to be witnessing. What do we expect from the U.S. Navy? Any potential for it to beef up its presence in the Persian Gulf region as a response to this? What are you watching for?
So I don't expect that there will be some big beefing up. What the U.S. Navy has been doing over the last year or so is dispatching a bunch of sea-based drones. Now, these are small craft sail drones. You may remember those because the Iranians actually picked up a sail drone not too long ago. Well, the U.S. has really expanded that program throughout that area, and they have these drones all throughout the area. They do everything from watching patterns of life, which is essentially watching where ships are coming and going, to also checking to see where some of these incidents are occurring and watching how these Iranian ships are operating. But as far as large destroyers or large aircraft carriers, large ships like that, I don't expect the U.S. military to frankly, have the ships that they can up their presence there anytime soon, Peter.
We said thanks to Mike Memley and Kelly Cobier. Courtney Kuby, we thank you as well. And as we mentioned here, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is headed to China at a key moment in U.S.-Chinese relations. CNBC's Eunice Yoon has more on that from Beijing. Eunice?
Peter, Secretary Yellen lands in Beijing on Thursday. Over 4 days, she'll meet with Chinese officials, including her counterpart, as well as members of the U.S. business community. There is no expectation at this time that she'll meet with President Xi Jinping. Now, her visit, only weeks after Secretary of State Blinken was here, is part of a greater effort by the Biden administration to restore functioning and constructive dialogue. The two sides have had little communication over the last year after then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, angering Beijing. The Chinese leadership has indicated that they're happy to speak with Yellen and focusing talks on the economy. Beijing also seems alarmed about the greater emphasis in Washington and other advanced economies on de-risking or cutting reliance from China. There's an expectation that Chinese policymakers will argue against it to Yellen, who's seen as more sympathetic on the issue. She's widely quoted in state media for saying decoupling, what Chinese believe is the same as de-risking, would be disastrous. Expectations are low for a significant change in the relationship. Indications are that the Chinese are not willing to address Washington's concerns about their policies. On Monday, China announced curbs on exports of two metals used in electric cars and microchips from August 1st, which could present problems for American industry and is exactly the kind of step encouraging Washington to restrict its economic ties to Beijing. And on Tuesday, President Xi Jinping attended a virtual conference which included Russian President Vladimir Putin and Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi, deepening relations with some of America's adversaries. Peter?
All right, Eunice Yoon, appreciate that reporting there. And coming up right here, we're digging deeper into the consequences of the deteriorating relationship between the U.S. and China. A Republican member of the House Select Committee on China will join us next. Plus, confirmation of cocaine in the West Wing. The latest developments on the Secret Service investigation into how it got there and who it belongs to. Some new information we're hearing now from the White House on this. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
We have disagreements. My hope in traveling to China is to reestablish contact. There are a new group of leaders. We need to get to know one another, and we need to discuss our disagreements with one another so that we don't have misunderstandings, don't misunderstand one another's intentions.
Welcome back. That was, of course, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking to MSNBC recently about her trip to China. As we mentioned, Yellen's visit comes after President Xi met with the leaders of Russia and India as Beijing tries to expand its global influence amid growing tensions with the West. And joining us now is the South Dakota Republican Congressman Dusty Johnson. He is a member of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. Congressman Johnson, I appreciate your being here. I hope you had a good 4th. I want to get right down to the business of what we're witnessing happening overseas right now. The Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, you've heard her downplay recently the expectations for this visit. But what does success in your eyes look like in the near term in the U.S.'s dealings with China?
Well, I would say, first off, when Secretary Yellen is in China, I certainly hope her tone is one of firmness rather than flirtation. We do want to make sure that we're talking to China. That communication is critically important. But we, I think, at different times in this relationship, particularly with the Biden administration, have looked almost supplicant, as though we're trying to make sure that China likes us. This is a relationship that we've got to rebalance. We have got to make sure that this relationship serves American interests rather than just Chinese interests. And as far as what does success look like in this relationship long term, we have got to see some behavior change with the Chinese Communist Party. We cannot let them continue to undermine the basic American and world values of liberty, prosperity, and freedom.
And Congressman, for clarity, the president has been anything but flirtatious with President Xi recently. Behind closed doors in the last several weeks, President Biden called President Xi Jinping a dictator. Do you agree with that?
Well, I thought that I give the president some kudos for that statement. I think that was maybe on an unintentional bit of truth telling from him. There was some walking back from the administration because.
But he said it publicly and stood by it.
That's right. Well, and frankly, let's be honest. Xi Jinping is a dictator. It's not the kind of thing you normally say in sweet diplomatic talk. But I give the president kudos for coming right out and saying it.
All right, fine. Let me ask you about this visit. It comes, of course, at a time when President Xi is meeting with Russia's Vladimir Putin, India's Prime Minister Modi there as well, meeting virtually. How concerned you are about China's dealings with these two countries at this time?
I wouldn't overstate the importance of this summit. It's been going on for 20 years. I think it is noteworthy that India, the host, decided to have this be a virtual summit. Modi, I was part of the escort team for the prime minister when he was in D.C. a couple of weeks ago, did have an opportunity to briefly talk with him. And while he was in Washington, he talked a lot about the importance of democratic values. I don't think he liked the look of having Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin strutting around his country. So the move to a virtual summit was good news.
So President Xi reportedly warned Putin against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That's one of the new headlines, first came from the FT. Is that an encouraging sign, or is it something that you're skeptical about?
I do want to see even more from the Chinese Communist Party. They could help make sure that this Ukrainian-Russian conflict moves in the right direction. There is all kinds of evidence that they have been providing aid, non-lethal, non-weapon aid to Russia, but aid nonetheless. I like the fact that they're warning against nuclear arms or nuclear action, but I'd like to see them go even further.
Let me ask you about that region for a minute. Some striking new polling from NBC shows that a majority of Republican primary voters right now say they would be less likely to vote for a candidate who supports funding Ukraine's war effort. You clearly have backed additional funding for Ukraine. What is your reaction to that number, and what is the consequence if the majority of Republicans, majority of members of your party get their way on that issue?
This is not a binary issue where it's either yes to more money or no, never to any more money. Most primary voters I talk to, and frankly, most members of Congress, they'd want to make sure that whatever we do in the future doesn't look like a blank check. We do need some accountability. It has been a lot of money. We do want to make sure the Ukrainian government is making good use of those dollars. And most primary voters I talk to are a lot more interested in providing lethal aid, making sure that the Ukrainian soldiers have the ammunition they need to hold the line. They're more comfortable with that than checks for, 10 or 20 or $30 billion.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's not what our poll shows, though. And obviously, it's not what a lot of Republican lawmakers, frankly, have said publicly as well on this issue, right? I mean, what is the consequence, do you think, if that were to happen, if the funding were to stop? What's the risk if these voters, at least according to this polling by a wide margin, got their way?
Well, ask stupid questions, you're going to get stupid answers. This is not a binary issue where it's yes or no. I think most Americans who follow this at all have a nuanced view of this. They know that Putin is the bad guy. They know that the Ukrainians need to have the primary responsibility for defending their country. But to some degree, they know that freedom-loving countries in America, like America and in Europe, have a role to play. I think the American voter has a lot more nuance than maybe the question would let on.
Let me ask you about President Biden. He's meeting with the Swedish Prime Minister today as Sweden is angling to get, into NATO right now. Why doesn't the administration deserve credit for how it's fortified and even expanded NATO to this point?
I don't know that I'm denying them any credit. I do think we want to take a long
The leading Republican voice, Donald Trump, is, I guess. So I just say that as you may not be, but many Republicans have been denying the president for credit, I think, for his handling of this circumstance. Do you think that's unfair? If we're going to be
frank and earnest, there is so little confidence among Republican members of Congress for the competence of the Biden administration. I just don't think they're inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think particularly when you talk about there are times when I think the Biden administration does good things, of course. I
mean, isn't NATO, do we agree that NATO's stronger? I'm going to be in Vilnius with the president next week. NATO's going to be stronger than it's been, and certainly in the last, I think, several years, perhaps in the last decade plus. There's a new name that's joined it, Finland. The president will be there as well, and Sweden may join it soon.
I wouldn't want to give Joe Biden too much credit for that. I think Vladimir Putin deserves the lion's share of the credit for the sense of unity that the NATO countries have. When you're talking about, new entrants, though, you immediately get to Ukraine. And I do think there are some very prominent voices that want to make sure that anything we do with regard to NATO expansion is going to make the world safer as opposed to less safe.
Let me ask you a little bit about politics, if I can, before we go. Your state's two senators both have publicly backed Tim Scott for president. Who are you leaning toward? Anybody that you will not back in this race?
I don't really do endorsements. I've grown more and more irritated by them. I just don't know that any South Dakota primary voter is going to vote a particular way because Dusty Johnson tells them so. So I'm not planning to endorse anybody. Tim Scott would be a great president of the United States. I would be ecstatic if he was elected, but that doesn't mean I'm going to endorse him or anybody else.
All right. Well, we appreciate your humility in that answer. Congressman Dusty Johnson, nice to see you as always. A happy 4th holiday to you as well. Appreciate it. Coming up next right here, the White House facing yet another setback in court as a federal judge blocks key administration officials from communicating with social media companies about misinformation or other content on their platforms. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We first broke the news here yesterday about that dime-sized bag of white powder that was found in the West Wing of the White House. Now an official with knowledge of the investigation tells NBC News that a lab test confirms that the substance is, in fact, cocaine. This powder was discovered in what the White House describes as a highly trafficked area of the West Wing. It was found on Sunday night. Not clear how long the bag had been in the White House or even how it got there. At this point, it's a real whodunit. And my colleague Mike Memley is joining me again now from the White House. Mem, for the first time, the White House is really answering some questions about this situation. They insist that President Biden wants the Secret Service to get to the bottom of it. So walk us through what we know, the focus of the investigation, and how anything like that, you and I work in that building, how anything like that just sort of gets snuck in and dropped off, so to speak.
Yeah, Peter, you've already laid out some of the ways in which our team, as well, you, Kelly O'Donnell, Monica Alba, and myself have been ahead of this story, really laying out some of the key details. The first to report that this was discovered in the West Wing, the first to report that it did test positive in this more conclusive test today as cocaine. It was worth noting the ways in which this investigation, as we understand it, being led by the Secret Service, is one that when we finally did hear from Karine Jean-Pierre, from any White House official publicly, frankly, on this matter, they were largely outsourcing all of these questions about even the very nature of what that investigation looks like to the Secret Service. Here's some of what Karine Jean-Pierre had to say today from the podium.
So, as you know, this is under the purview of the Secret Service. They are currently investigating what happened over the weekend, so I would have to refer you to the Secret Service on all of this. But one thing that I can share, that I'll share a little bit more information. As you know, the President and the First Lady and their family were not here this weekend. Where this was discovered is a heavily traveled area where many White House, West Wing, I should be even more specific, West Wing visitors come through this particular area. I just don't have anything more to share. It is under investigation by the Secret Service.
So, Peter, the strong suggestion from White House sources that I've been talking to and from what we heard from Karine Jean-Pierre today is that the most likely scenario is that this was encountered because of somebody who came to the West Wing as a guest of a White House staffer. These are tours, private tours of the West Wing that any member of the staff can offer in certain specified windows, including this past weekend before this was discovered. But of course, the investigation will ultimately help determine that by using things like the visitor logs, security cameras, to see if they can help narrow down when this might have been placed there.
Yeah, a lot of questions we're going to be asking about this, a situation that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to this point. We'll try to get better details. Mike Memley at the White House. Mem, thank you. The cocaine found in the West Wing, just one of several domestic issues facing the president right now. Yesterday, a federal judge ruled against the administration restricting some agencies and officials from contacting social media companies to moderate their content. Joining me now to dive into the political pressure and what it might mean for President Biden's reelection bid is our panel. Basil Smikle, director of the public policy program at the Roosevelt House Institute at Hunter College and a Democratic strategist. And John Podhoretz is the editor at Commentary Magazine. Gentlemen, nice to have you. Thank you. Our little rustic table as we get together on this hot summer day. Let me ask you about this, Basil. I wanted to get your reaction to the social media decision from the judge right now. In the injunction, the judge wrote that in response to the pandemic, quote, the United States government seems to have assumed a role similar to an Orwellian ministry of truth. The plaintiffs have presented substantial evidence in support of their claims that they were the victims of a far-reaching and widespread censorship campaign. So how does this complicate the administration's effort going forward, especially ahead of the 2024 campaign cycle, to combat misinformation?
Well, that's a challenge, right? That's the combating of the misinformation. That was what the purpose of this was. So as we believe, and it's going to be a challenge because, you know, and I teach this to my students, negative information travels more quickly than positive information. And so it is not just problematic for the administration, it's problematic for Congress as they try to figure out how to actually tamp down on this legislatively. So it's going to be hard for them to do this. Not impossible, but I think that's where the administration and the campaign itself really has to step up. They're going to have to spend a lot of money, do a lot of engagement, put a lot of surrogates on the street to be able to counter that. But it's almost impossible to do.
And this is just one example of a series of court decisions lately, some coming from the Supreme Court, we should note right now, obviously, Does this one sort of add to that culture war? Is this something that's going to sort of fortify the culture war argument that a lot of Republicans are making right now, John, on the campaign trail?
I don't think so. I think something very specific is going on here. Facebook and Twitter, two social media companies that matter here, are private companies. They're private. Twitter is privately held, obviously, by Elon Musk. And they're private companies, and they can do with misinformation and how they think it is important to moderate content. That is their business. It is a very open question whether the government of the United States, governed under the First Amendment of the Constitution, which says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the press, what possible role the government of the United States should be playing in fingering, targeting, or guiding private businesses that deal with content and telling them what is and what is not bad or good content. This is a very slippery slope. That's why the judge said that there was something Orwellian about it. And I think a lot of the coverage of this assumes that there is something righteous about going after misinformation. Governments aren't supposed to go after misinformation.
Basil, your thoughts on that?
I don't disagree with you, but I want to focus on that Orwellian point, because I think what we do see, just as the average American, is that when misinformation spreads quickly, we get things like January 6th. And so the question is, how do you push back on that? How do you fight that? And that's sort of that area that we haven't figured out yet, because there are people out there who are clearly ready to do harm in various ways. How do we get these companies to be able to stop that by limiting the kind of information that they put out and the speed with which it spreads?
And then all of this obviously against a campaign backdrop here, right? So as we look ahead to 2024, President Biden facing some challenges domestically, foreign challenges as well, as he prepares to travel overseas. I'll be with him next week right now. We haven't really heard from President Biden publicly in some of these key moments right now. We did hear from the former White House advisor, David Axelrod, who told the Wall Street Journal, this quote was striking: "Having the discretion to know when to speak and when not to speak is a good presidential ability. It's not necessarily a good campaign strategy. There is also a need to tell a story, Basil, about where the country is going." What do you make about this unique challenge the White House faces right now? Because President Biden, obviously, the challenge is to sort of break through in these moments. He enjoys looking presidential when the former president, mind you, is facing indictments. But even on key issues like the apparent mutiny we were witnessing in Russia, we heard almost nothing from President Biden.
It is a challenge. It's interesting because years ago we were concerned about how much he does say, because he has this ability to gaffe quite frequently, right? Now it's almost too controlled. And that's concerning, not just because of what you mentioned in terms of Russia, for example, but how much is he able to do and say based on all these issues that are going to be able to motivate voters, that is the Supreme Court is deciding on. You know, if he doesn't speak on it enough, if he's not engaged enough, the danger is that he is not going to gin up the base in the ways in which it can to get out those supporters. Even among his base, we saw that African-American voters didn't come out in the numbers we expected in 2022. That cannot happen again in 2024 for the party.
John, is it enough for the president, for the White House, for Democrats to just let Americans watch what the Republicans may be arguing over and some of the views that the White House deems are more extreme? Is that enough to do it, or do you have to hit them over the head and make it clear where your positions differ?
Well, it's like a prevent defense, right? What they're afraid of is Biden tripping over himself, not only gaffing, but seeming old, seeming out of touch, seeming as though there is some issue involving his mental acuity, and therefore they seem to have decided that caution is better than daring. And I think that prevent defense is generally a bad idea in football, and I think it's a pretty bad idea in politics, particularly when you have a hyper-aggressive guy in Trump. And the simple fact of the matter is that the polling is not showing that this is working for Biden. His approval numbers are down. He and Trump are basically tied in national polls. He cannot imagine, they can't really believe that they have 16 months from now in which they can say as little as possible and sort of play the pandemic game of being in the basement and coming up and saying things and then going back down. There's no pandemic. There's no excuse. There's no way to avoid engaging in these issues. And if you avoid it, you're going to look like you're hiding and like you have something to hide.
President Biden goes to South Carolina tomorrow. He'll be focusing, per the White House, on what they're now calling Bidenomics, right? This is the way they're framing the economy right now. My take, as someone who covers the White House day in, day out, is that at the end of the day, what the economy looks like in those several months leading up to the election could be the thing that ultimately decides this in a 50-50 country right now. But as they recast this economic issue, Basil, as Bidenomics, is that a positive or a negative there? The Republicans sort of like that framing. They say, hey, everything you dislike about the economy, call it Bidenomics.
That's right. You know, I think it works in this moment because the economy is doing well. Couple of months from now.
Why you say the economy is doing well? By most metrics, the economy is doing well. Why do most Americans not think the economy is doing well?
Because a lot have bought into the idea that the government's not for them. Obviously, the Biden numbers, as you say, were soft. The numbers about Congress are soft. The numbers on the Supreme Court are soft. People are generally not happy with where their government is right now, and I think that extends into other aspects of their life. Plus, we also dealt with a period of inflation that's now starting to ease. But the economy is doing well, particularly when you look at the unemployment number. So he can talk about that. The danger is, does it flip, does it change as we get closer to the election, and then he doesn't have the opportunity to sort of reframe and re-message. Having said that, very quickly, I do think that on all these other sort of issues, being in South Carolina is really important because of Jim Clyburn. Mm-hmm. Take that endorsement from 2020. Talk about the ways in which he unites the older generation and younger generation.
That's why he's here, let's be clear.
Exactly right. Use that as the springboard to talk about economics or any other issue.
I just think you can't look at the economic numbers and say, you have to say inflation, inflation, inflation. You can tell people that the economy is good. If they don't feel it
I agree
at
with
home,
that too.
then you can speak forever. It's not going to make a difference.
Basil Spiegel, John Podhoretz, I agree with everything you guys are saying on this topic. Thanks, gentlemen, very much. And after this break, a direct and serious threat to the public. New details revealed today by the Justice Department as federal prosecutors try to keep a January 6th rioter behind bars. You're watching Meet the Press now. We're back now, and federal prosecutors are issuing a stark new warning about a January 6th rioter who was arrested near former President Obama's home late last week. In a new court filing today, the Department of Justice called Taylor Taranto a, quote, direct and serious threat to the public. Taranto was arrested last week outside the Obama's home with 2 guns and 400 rounds of ammunition. Taranto appeared in court today for a detention hearing. Ryan Riley covers the Justice Department for NBC News. He is joining us now with the latest on this. Ryan, what makes Taylor Taranto different from all the other January 6th defendants?
You know, for one, he was publicly identified more than nearly 2 years ago. Actually, the way this came about was online sleuths were looking for an individual who may have assaulted the late officer Jeffrey Smith, who was with the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. They got a hit and actually went back to a photo of Taylor Taranto, of this individual who was actually posing with a cardboard cutout of former President Trump on a website affiliated with his county GOP. So very quickly, he was actually sued by the widow of this officer, along with another future defendant who has subsequently been arrested. Just a couple weeks ago, when that other individual, David Wallace Kaufman, was being sentenced, he eventually got 2 months in federal prison. I saw Taylor Taranto walk into the back of court, and he was on his phone. The marshals spoke to him and pulled him out of court because you're not supposed to be on your phone during these ongoing proceedings. But he's been living out of a van down by the D.C. jail for a couple of months now, and has made trips over the course of the past almost 2 years to D.C. And it's been one of those sort of questions why the FBI hadn't arrested him up to this point. He had this cane with him that day that had sort of a sharpened edge. It was like sort of a defensive cane, and he was scrappling with officers as they pushed him out of the Capitol right after Ashley Babbitt was shot. And he actually got kicked out and sort of got kicked away from the rallies in support of January 6th defendants by the jail because he was trying to show video of Ashley Babbitt's death and expressed his belief that Ashley Babbitt was actually an actor, as were all of the officers around him. He doesn't actually think that Ashley Babbitt was shot that day, so he's pretty disconnected from reality.
Yeah, no doubt here. And what it does sort of remind you, right, is that these defendants from January 6th, it's not like they just disappear, that they go away. I mean, these guys, in many cases like this guy, are hiding in plain sight and still have these strong extreme views on some of these issues here. He faces 4 misdemeanor charges. Are prosecutors likely to file additional charges against him?
That seems likely, and that's what they indicated in this latest court filing. Actually, his detention hearing is ongoing right now. I think the most likely charge, by that indication of the court filings, is for the weapons that were found in his vehicle, which was parked near the Obama's residence. They found 400 rounds of ammunition along with a couple of guns, so that could earn him a separate charge. It's unclear whether he'll earn an additional charge out of the January 6th conduct itself. Usually it boils down to what exactly sort of pre-planning there was for the January 6th, or what rhetoric different defendants used. So I think that's an open question right now.
Yeah, Ryan Riley, appreciate your reporting on the story. A lot of people have been paying attention to that in recent days. Thanks so much. And still to come right here, the spiraling escalation of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what it means for stability in that region and for the U.S. We're going to have the latest from the West Bank ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. We're back now, and Israeli troops pulled out of the city of Jenin in the occupied West Bank early this morning after carrying out the largest military operation in decades aimed at destroying Palestinian militants' weapons and infrastructure sites. Drone footage from this morning shows hundreds of men marching in a funeral procession through the streets of that city, mourning the 12 Palestinians killed in the operation, among them at least 5 militant fighters. An Israeli soldier was also killed in the fighting. As is often the case in this decades-long dispute between the Israelis and Palestinians, an act of violence from one side prompts retaliatory responses. Militant group Hamas praised a car ramming and stabbing in the Israeli city of Tel Aviv that followed yesterday. A large explosion was seen over Gaza City this morning after Israel reported it intercepted rockets fired at Israel from Gaza. The Israelis striking back, with the government reporting it hit a weapons factory in Gaza early today. And NBC's Matt Bradley has the latest from Jenin following the troop withdrawal. Matt, with tons of praise for you for your brave reporting on the ground. I want to get to you in a moment. We're also joined by Aaron David Miller, the senior fellow in the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, also a former State Department analyst who worked on Arab-Israeli peace efforts. Matt, you were there. You were on the front lines. You witnessed the Israeli forces as they moved in there, surprising not just the journalists, but certainly a lot of the Palestinians on the ground. What is the latest in Jenin right now? What are you seeing in the day after those Israeli forces pull out?
Well, I have to tell you, Peter, we're actually in Jerusalem right now. We left Jenin a few hours ago, but we were there all day, and what we saw was extraordinary. I mean, we saw a community of people, of Palestinians, who were quite literally and figuratively picking up the pieces of what was left out of that extraordinary 2-day incursion by the Israelis into Jenin. And, you know, this was a very interesting thing to witness, because for them, for the Palestinians, the fact that the Israelis left after only about 48 hours, they took that as a sign of victory. You mentioned just a moment ago how Hamas had claimed and praised that attack in Tel Aviv against civilians. Well, they've also said, just in the last couple of hours, Hamas coming out with a statement saying that the militants were victorious, and that's why the Israelis finally left. And actually, when we spoke to Palestinians in Jenin, not just in the city of Jenin, but actually in that refugee camp that was the focus, the real target of the Israeli incursion, they had that feeling that they were victorious, that the Israelis left because they pushed them out. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu last night came out and, of course, said that the Israelis had basically had a mission accomplished, and that he left open the door for further incursions by the Israelis into Jenin and other places in the West Bank. You also mentioned that, you know, one of the real risks here was a tit-for-tat or a retaliation. We did see that a little bit. We saw rockets fired last night from the Gaza Strip into Israel proper, and then the Israelis answered with their own rockets or their own missiles fired into Gaza. But that was brief, and that really just showed that this situation, at least at this very moment, might not spill over out of Jenin in any real way into other places. As you've seen before in the past, this same pattern of violence often creates a response, not necessarily just from the West Bank, but also from the Gaza Strip. And that can lead to days, weeks of exchanging of rockets and missiles back and forth, which tends to result in thousands of Palestinian deaths and can result in some Israeli deaths as well. So we, for the moment, seem to have avoided that kind of fate. But there is a lot of tension there. And walking around in Jenin, in that city, seeing people sweeping up the dust and the soot from all of those burning fires, from the tear gas that was fired by the Israelis, watching them repair windows, they seem like a population that is just inured. It's just used to violence. And for them, this was just another day in a very violent life. And
well,
Aaron, this is a situation that I think is just going to be on repeat.
Yeah, Aaron, I was going to say to you, it does feel like that to much of the rest of the world watching what we saw there. Obviously, this was a larger scale effort by the Israelis in Jenin. But what does happen now? Prime Minister Netanyahu, he said that this is just the start of operations in that area. What are you preparing to witness happen next here?
This is part of an ongoing peace. And I think the situation is going to get worse before it gets even worse. You've got three factors driving the situation. None of them can be ameliorated anytime soon. Number one, you have a Palestinian Authority that is unwilling and unable to exercise its security control, particularly in the northern West Bank, particularly in a city like Jenin, the third largest city in the West Bank. Number two, you have the most right-wing fundamentalist government in the history of the state of Israel that is pursuing a policy of trying to annex the West Bank in everything except name only. And number three, you have the emergence of informal groups of young men, 15 to 25, not organizationally affiliated with Hamas or Palestine Islamic Jihad, but being encouraged by them, which are putting up a remarkable sort of resistance and maintaining the capacity to carry out attacks against Israel in the West Bank and Israel proper. So the fact is, I don't want to trivialize by saying this because people were killed and many innocent Palestinians wounded, but this is a wash, rinse, and repeat cycle, which is only going to get worse. No massive, sustained third intifada, I don't think, but just a long slog of daily, weekly confrontations between the Israeli Defense Forces and organized and unorganized Palestinian groups.
But, Aaron, this is a bit striking, right, having been in that region with the president only a matter of months ago, right, in the wake of the Abraham Accords, where Israel's had a new normalizing of relations with a variety of countries there, even the potential for some sort of relationship to develop with Saudi Arabia. It appears now that Iran, again, has been sort of fueling this effort on the Palestinian side. What is the state of the Palestinian people, though, right now? They are a people without a home there, as Israel has been building its relationships throughout that region. Is this sort of Iran and the Palestinians' effort, to continue to fight back, I guess, independent of that effort?
Look, not every national movement, we've seen it in the case of the Armenians and the Kurds, find their national aspirations fulfilled and requited. And Palestinians, in my judgment, the least bad option, frankly, is the pursuit of a two-state solution. But frankly, under these circumstances, that's virtually impossible. So you have a divided Palestinian national movement. You have two of everything. It's like Noah's Ark. You've got two constitutions, one in Hamas controlling Gaza, one in the West Bank by Fatah. You have two sets of security services and two sets of patrons. So it's virtually impossible for me to believe that you were going to have a unified Palestinian national strategy. And even if you did, you have a government in Israel that is unwilling to even meet basic or minimum Palestinian needs and requirements.
So what should the U.S. role then, Aaron? So what should the U.S. role then be in this region vis-a-vis this conflict?
I worked for half a dozen secretaries of state of both political parties. My days of providing advice to the United States, frankly, is over. I would only say this to you, that governing is about choosing. It's deciding what your priorities are. And at this moment, this administration, with a president running for a second term, with a dysfunctional political climate of hyper-partisanship, with Russia and Ukraine and a rising China. Frankly, if you were Mr. Biden, you would wish, if you had a wish, that you wouldn't hear from Israelis or Palestinians at least until 2025.
I think that, unfortunately, is probably the way that the priority system works right now, with the situation in Russia and Ukraine so urgent, the real fears about the situation in China as well. Matt Bradley on the ground for us in Jerusalem now, safely out of the West Bank. Aaron David Miller, always a pleasure to get your perspective and hear your expertise. Thanks for making time to talk to us. That's going to do it for us at this hour. We are going to be back tomorrow, obviously. We're going to have more reporting on Meet the Press Now. We're going to keep a very close eye on the situation there in Israel as it continues to develop. President Biden, as we noted, will be traveling to South Carolina tomorrow. The latest on that as well. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.